Hey guys, tonight we're going to time travel back to what historians love to call the High Middle Ages. You know, that magical time when life was supposedly simple, pure, and harmonious. Picture this: no smartphones to distract you, no traffic jams to stress about, and definitely no student loans crushing your soul. Just you, your Lord, your God, and the sweet certainty that your place in the world was decided the moment you popped out of your mother's womb. Sounds pretty peaceful, right? Well, buckle up, because we're about to discover just how perfect this medieval paradise really was. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just been born in the year 1320, somewhere in the rolling hills of what we now call France. The good news: you're alive in one of the most stable periods in European history. The bad news: well, let's just say your modern definition of stable is about to get a serious reality check. But first, let's appreciate your new medieval lifestyle. You wake up every morning in your cozy one-room cottage, and by cozy, I mean you share this 400 square foot space with your parents, 3 siblings, 2 goats, a pig, and whatever chickens haven't been eaten by wolves yet. Think of it as the original open concept living, except the concept was survival and the opening was mostly holes in the walls that you pray don't let in too much rain. Your morning routine is refreshingly simple. No endless scroll through social media, no choosing between 17 different coffee flavors. You wake up when the rooster crows, assuming it survived the night, splash some water on your face from the bucket that's been sitting there for God knows how long, and get straight to work. No existential crisis about your life purpose here. You're a peasant, your purpose is to not die today. Mission accomplished if you make it to sunset. The social structure around you is beautifully clear-cut, like a perfectly organized pyramid scheme that God himself apparently designed. At the top, you've got the king. Think of him as the CEO of medieval Europe Inc., except his qualifications for the job were literally just, "My dad was the previous CEO." Below him, there's a neat layer of nobles who own all the land, including the patch of dirt your family has been farming for generations. These are basically your landlords, except instead of just taking your money, they also get to decide if you can marry, where you can travel, and whether you deserve to keep breathing. Then there's the church, which functions as both your spiritual guidance system and your local government, court system, school, hospital, and entertainment venue, all rolled into one. The village priest is like your personal Google, Wikipedia, and Netflix combined, except he only has one answer to every question. God wills it. Plague killing your neighbors. God wills it. Crops failing. God wills it. Lord's son raped your daughter. Well, God works in mysterious ways. And finally, there's you, the bottom of this beautiful pyramid, the foundation upon which this entire glorious system rests. You're a serf, which is basically a slave with better marketing. You can't leave your lord's land without permission, you can't marry without approval, and you work his fields for free about half the week. But hey, in exchange, he promises to protect you from bandits and foreign armies. It's like a medieval protection racket, except it's totally legal and blessed by God. Your daily work schedule would make modern labor activists weep. You're up before dawn, working the fields until your back screams for mercy, then heading home to tend your own tiny plot of land. Because yes, After working for free all day, you still need to grow your own food. But here's the kicker, you can't even sell your surplus crops without your Lord's permission, and he gets first dibs on everything anyway. The food situation is, let's call it, rustic. Your diet consists mainly of dark bread that could double as a weapon, porridge that tastes like wet cardboard, and whatever vegetables you can coax out of the ground. Meat is for special occasions, like when one of your animals dies of natural causes or when the Lord feels generous enough to let you hunt a rabbit. Most of your calories come from ile, which is actually safer to drink than the water. So you're basically buzzed from dawn to dusk, which honestly might be the only thing making this lifestyle bearable. But here's what's truly beautiful about your medieval existence: certainty. You know exactly who you are, where you belong, and what your future holds. You're a peasant, you'll always be a peasant, your children will be peasants, and their children will be peasants until the end of time. No career anxiety, no FOMO, no midlife crisis. Your biggest life decision is whether to plant barley or oats this season. The social events in your village are absolutely thrilling. There's church on Sunday, where you stand for hours listening to Latin sermons you don't understand while trying not to faint from hunger. There are seasonal festivals where everyone gets together to celebrate things like, "We survived another winter," or "The harvest didn't completely fail this year." And occasionally, there's a good old-fashioned public execution or two to really spice things up. Your healthcare system is admirably simple. Feeling sick? The four humors in your body are obviously out of balance. The solution? Bloodletting, of course. Headache? More bloodletting. Broken leg? Believe it or not, bloodletting. The local barber surgeon has exactly one tool in his toolkit, and by God, he's going to use it. If bloodletting doesn't work, well, it's probably because you haven't prayed hard enough. Personal hygiene is refreshingly low maintenance. You bathe maybe twice a year, Christmas and your wedding day, if you're lucky enough to have one. The rest of the time, you just mask the natural human aroma with whatever herbs you can find. Deodorant hasn't been invented yet, but honestly, when everyone smells like a barnyard, no one really notices. The best part about your medieval life is the complete absence of social mobility anxiety. There's no pressure to make something of yourself, because the something has already been decided for you. No student debt because there are no schools. No career ladder to climb because there is no ladder. You are where God put you, and that's where you'll stay. It's almost Zen, like in its simplicity. Your entertainment options are delightfully limited. There's storytelling around the fire, assuming you can afford fire. There's watching the village idiot do idiotic things, which never gets old. And if you're really lucky, maybe a traveling minstrel will show up once a year to sing songs about knights and ladies who live completely different lives than yours. This is your world in 1320, predictable, stable, God-ordained, and absolutely perfect in its medieval way. You have your place, everyone has their place, and nothing ever really changes. The system has worked this way for centuries, and there's no reason to think it won't continue working this way for centuries more. Your children will live exactly like you do. Your grandchildren too. The social order is as permanent as the mountains, as unchanging as the seasons, as eternal as God himself. What could possibly go wrong? But as you drift off to sleep on your straw mattress, listening to the familiar sounds of your family's snoring and your livestock's breathing, you have no idea that in just a few short years, everything, absolutely everything, you think you know about the world is about to change forever. Fast forward to October 1347. You're now 27 years old, practically ancient by medieval standards, and you've survived everything your perfectly ordered world could throw at you. Bad harvests, brutal winters, a few minor wars that barely touched your village. You've even managed to get married and produce 2 children who somehow made it past their 5th birthdays, which honestly makes you something of a medieval success story. Life has been, well, exactly what you expected. The same backbreaking routine, the same small victories and defeats, the same unchanging rhythm that has defined European peasant life for centuries. Your biggest worry this autumn is whether you've stored enough grain for winter, and your wildest dream is maybe buying a second pig if the harvest money stretches far enough. But 800 miles south of your peaceful village, something extraordinary is happening in the bustling port of Kaffa, on the shores of the Black Sea. Though you've never heard of this place, your geographical knowledge extends about as far as the nearest market town. What's happening there is already heading your way with the relentless efficiency of a medieval Amazon delivery service. The Genoese traders in Kaffa are having what we might politely call a challenging business quarter. The Mongols have been besieging their trading post for months, which is bad for commerce, but great for building character. The siege itself isn't particularly unusual. Medieval people besieged each other with the casual frequency that modern people send passive-aggressive emails. But this siege has a special feature that would make even modern warfare experts pause and say, okay, that's genuinely creative. The Mongols have started catapulting corpses over the city walls. Now, you might think this is just standard medieval psychological warfare. Nothing says, surrender or else. Quite like having your neighbor's decaying body land in your marketplace. But these aren't just any corpses. These are the bodies of Mongol soldiers who died from something the locals are calling the Great Mortality. The symptoms include fever chills, vomiting, diarrhea, terrible aches, and here's the memorable part, black boils that swell up to the size of apples and burst with pus. Think of it as biological warfare, except the Mongols don't quite understand the biology part. They just know that people are dying horribly, and they figure why not share the experience with their enemies. It's the medieval equivalent of that friend who insists on showing you gross videos while you're trying to eat lunch. The Genoese merchants, being practical businessmen, decide that discretion is the better part of valor. They load up their ships with whatever goods they can carry and sail west toward home. What they don't realize is that they're also loading up something else, something much smaller than silk or spices, but infinitely more valuable in terms of its ability to change the world. Fleas. Specifically, fleas carrying a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, though of course nobody knows what bacteria are yet. These microscopic hitchhikers are about to become the most influential immigrants in European history. 12 Genoese galleys limping across the Mediterranean in the autumn of 1347, racing against time and death itself. By the time they reach various European ports, most of the sailors are already dead or dying. The ships that arrive in Messina in Sicily are floating graveyards with corpses scattered across the decks and a handful of survivors begging for help. The locals, displaying the same welcoming spirit that would later characterize European immigration policy, take one look at these death ships and immediately order them to leave. Nothing personal. They essentially say, but you all look terrible and smell worse. But it's too late. The damage is done. The fleas have already jumped ship, literally, and found new hosts among the dock workers, merchants, and curiosity seekers who got too close. Meanwhile, other ships from the same Kaffa fleet are making their way to different ports. Some reach Genoa, others head for Marseille, and a few continue north toward Venice, that shining jewel of medieval capitalism, where money flows like wine and exotic goods from the east fill warehouses to bursting. Venice in 1347 is basically the New York City of the medieval world. It's where ambitious young men go to make their fortunes, where different cultures collide in profitable chaos, where the latest fashions and ideas arrive before anywhere else. The city thrums with energy, ambition, and the constant clink of gold coins changing hands. The Venetians are used to ships arriving with strange cargo and stranger stories. Merchants regularly show up with tales of distant lands, exotic diseases, and peculiar customs. So when the Genoese ships limp into port with their cargo of death, the initial reaction is more curiosity than alarm. "Oh look," the Venetians might have said. More dramatic Genoese merchants with their tales of woe. They always were prone to exaggeration. But this time, the Genoese aren't exaggerating. If anything, they're understating the situation. The first symptoms appear within days. Dock workers who handled the cargo start complaining of fever and fatigue. Then come the headaches, the vomiting, the terrible aches that feel like your bones are trying to escape your body. And finally, the signature symptom that will give this plague its most famous name, the bibos. These aren't your garden variety medieval skin problems. These are grotesque swellings that appear in the lymph nodes, your armpits, groin, and neck, growing larger and more painful until they're impossible to ignore. They turn dark, almost black, giving the disease its eventual nickname, the Black Death. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In October 1347, it's still just a few sick dock workers in Venice, a handful of unusual deaths that could be attributed to any number of common medieval ailments. The city's physicians, such as they are, apply their standard treatments, bloodletting, herbal remedies, and earnest prayers to various saints who specialize in plague management. Nobody realizes that they're witnessing the opening act of the greatest catastrophe in European history. Nobody understands that those 12 ships from Kaffa are about to trigger a demographic collapse that will kill between 75 and 200 million people. Nobody knows that they're living through the last days of the medieval world as they know it. Back in your village, hundreds of miles from Venice, you're completely unaware that anything unusual is happening. You're focused on the normal concerns of autumn, preparing for winter, paying your feudal obligations, trying to keep your family healthy through the cold months ahead. The harvest was decent this year, not great but not terrible, and you're cautiously optimistic about making it through to spring. You have no idea that a microscopic army is already marching across Europe, moving along the same trade routes that carry spices, silk, and silver. No idea that the very system of commerce and communication that holds your medieval world together is about to become the highway for its destruction. But change is coming, whether you're ready for it or not. The first domino has already fallen in Venice, and the rest are lined up in a chain that stretches across every village, town, and city in Europe, including yours. By spring of 1348, the rumors have finally reached your village. Travelers passing through speak in hushed tones about cities where the dead pile up faster than they can be buried. About entire villages found empty except for rotting corpses and confused livestock. But you've heard wild stories from travelers before, tales of sea monsters, two-headed calves, and women who give birth to demons. Medieval people love a good horror story almost as much as they love complaining about the weather. Besides, your village priest, Father Benedict, has a perfectly reasonable explanation for these disturbing reports. God is punishing the wicked cities. He announces from his pulpit with the confidence of a man who's never been wrong about anything in his life. The merchants with their greed, the nobles with their pride, the common folk with their countless sins, they have brought this judgment upon themselves. This makes perfect sense to you. Cities are dens of corruption. Everyone knows that. Venice, Paris, London, they're basically medieval versions of Sodom and Gomorrah, filled with people who care more about gold than God, who indulge in luxuries while good Christian folk like yourself struggle to survive. If God wants to clean house by sending some kind of divine punishment to these urban sinkholes, well, that's between him and them. Your village is different. Sure, you're not perfect, nobody is, but you're God-fearing peasants who know your place in the divine order. You attend Mass faithfully. You pay your tithes even when it means your children go hungry, and you accept your suffering as part of God's plan. If this mysterious plague is truly divine justice, then you should be safe. Right? Wrong. The first case appears on a Tuesday morning in late May. Old Willem, who tends the Lord's pigs, doesn't show up for work. His wife finds him in their cottage, burning with fever and covered in sweat, muttering incoherently about black angels dancing in his vision. By Thursday, the fever breaks, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. Willem's always been tough as old leather. He survived the famine of 42, the harsh winter of 43, and that nasty bout of dysentery that killed half the village children 2 years ago. But Friday morning brings something no one has seen before. Willem's wife runs screaming through the village, pointing back toward their cottage with eyes wide as dinner plates. The curious neighbors who follow her find Willem sitting up in bed, very much alive, but sporting what looks like a black apple growing out of his left armpit. Father Benedict is summoned immediately. He takes one look at Willem's condition and pronounces his professional diagnosis: demon possession. The treatment is obvious: prayer, holy water, and perhaps a good old-fashioned exorcism if the demon proves particularly stubborn. The devil has chosen Willem as his vessel. The priest explains, probably because Willem has been harboring impure thoughts about the miller's wife. This explanation satisfies most of the villagers. Demon possession makes sense in your medieval worldview. It's terrifying but comprehensible, supernatural but manageable. If it's demons, then the church has tools to deal with demons. Holy water, prayer, sacred relics, these things have power over evil spirits. The natural order remains intact, but the demon in Willem proves remarkably resistant to traditional exorcism techniques. By Sunday, he's dead, his body covered in black boils that burst and leak foul, smelling pus. The smell is indescribable. Imagine every terrible odor you've ever encountered. Multiply it by 10, then add the sickly, sweet stench of rotting flowers. It's the kind of smell that makes you understand why medieval people believed in hell. Father Benedict, maintaining his theological authority, declares Willem's death a victory. The demon has been cast out. He announces triumphantly, Willem's soul is now at peace in heaven, cleansed of his earthly sins. The village breathes easier. One possessed villager, one successful exorcism. Problem solved. Except it's not solved. By the following Tuesday, 3 more villagers are sporting those distinctive black swellings. By Friday, it's 7. By the next Monday, 23 people are either dead or dying, and Father Benedict is running out of demons to blame. The symptoms are horrifyingly consistent. First comes the fever, so intense that people strip naked in the middle of winter, begging for cold water that only makes them shiver uncontrollably. Then the headaches that feel like someone driving nails into your skull with a hammer made of lightning. The vomiting starts next, violent retching that empties your stomach. then your bile, then just painful dry heaves that leave you weak as a newborn lamb. But the real nightmare begins with the buboes. These aren't just swollen glands. They're grotesque distortions of the human form, black masses that grow larger each day until they dominate entire sections of the body. They appear in your armpits, your groin, your neck, anywhere your body's defensive systems try to fight the invasion and fail spectacularly. The pain is indescribable, like having molten metal poured directly into your lymph nodes. Some victims develop a variant that's even worse, if such a thing is possible. Instead of the buboes, they begin coughing up blood, bright red froth that sprays from their mouths with each ragged breath. These patients die faster, sometimes within hours, but they also spread the disease more efficiently, turning every cough into a weapon of mass destruction. Father Benedict cycles through increasingly desperate theological explanations. First it was demons, then God's punishment for specific sins, then a test of faith like Job endured in the Bible. Perhaps, he suggests with obvious desperation, God is calling his most faithful servants home to heaven early, sparing them the tribulations of the final days. This explanation becomes harder to maintain when Father Benedict himself develops a fever on a Wednesday morning in June. By Thursday, the black swellings appear under his arms. By Friday, he's delirious, speaking in tongues that sound more like the ravings of madness than divine inspiration. By Saturday evening, the man who spent his entire adult life explaining God's will to others dies in agony, his body covered in the same black boils that have claimed 47 of his parishioners. The theological implications are staggering. According to everything you've been taught since childhood, priests are God's representatives on earth, protected by divine grace and sacred authority. They're supposed to be immune to demonic influence, shielded by their holy vows and blessed by their sacred mission. If a priest can die from this disease, then either God has abandoned his own servants, or this isn't a supernatural plague at all. Neither possibility fits comfortably into your medieval worldview. The village's response to Father Benedict's death reveals just how desperately people cling to familiar explanations, even when those explanations have clearly failed. Some villagers insist that the priest's death proves his secret sinfulness. Perhaps he was secretly stealing from the church coffers, or having improper relationships with village women. Others maintain that his death was actually a divine reward, a translation to heaven like the prophet Elijah, except with more blood and pus. But you're starting to suspect something that you barely dare to think, let alone speak aloud. Maybe God isn't involved in this at all. This thought is genuinely terrifying, more frightening than demons or divine punishment or any supernatural explanation. If God isn't causing this plague, then he isn't controlling it either. And if God isn't controlling it, then prayer won't stop it, holy water won't cure it, and confession won't protect you from it. You're on your own in a universe that suddenly seems random, cruel, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. The death toll in your village climbs with mathematical precision. By midsummer, 68 people are dead out of a population that numbered barely 200 at the start of the year. The survivors are too few to maintain the normal routines of village life. Crops go unharvested because there aren't enough healthy people to bring them in. Animals starve in their pens because their owners are either dead or too sick to care for them. The Lord's manor house, that symbol of eternal feudal authority, stands empty. The Lord himself fled to his estates in the south when the plague first appeared, taking his family and most valuable possessions with him. His steward died in the second wave of infections, and his bailiff followed a week later. There's nobody left with the authority to collect rents, enforce feudal obligations, or maintain the social order that has defined your entire existence. For the first time in your life, you begin to understand that the world you thought was permanent, that beautiful, terrible, God-ordained system of lords and peasants, priests and believers, eternal hierarchy and divine justice, is actually far more fragile than anyone imagined, and it's disintegrating around you with the relentless efficiency of bacteria reproducing in a petri dish. The real horror isn't the disease itself, though that's bad enough. The real horror is the growing realization that everything you believed about how the world works was wrong. God hasn't abandoned Europe. He was never controlling it in the first place. The summer of 1348 brings a revelation that would have been unthinkable just months earlier, apparently. God didn't get the memo about social hierarchy. You remember learning from Father Benedict, back when he was still alive, to teach such things, that the great chain of being was absolute and eternal. God at the top, then angels, then kings, then nobles, then clergy, then merchants, then peasants like you at the very bottom. Everyone had their place, divinely ordained and cosmically justified. The rich were rich because God favored them. The poor were poor because God was testing them. Simple, logical, and completely immune to contradiction. Until now, news arrives with a surviving merchant who stumbles into what's left of your village. His once fine clothes, now tattered rags, his face bearing the haunted expression of someone who's seen the impossible become routine. He brings word from the great cities, and the news is so absurd that under normal circumstances, you'd laugh him out of town. The Duke of Normandy is dead, he announces to the handful of survivors gathered around the village well. Died screaming like a common peasant, covered in black boils the size of goose eggs. His castle has more corpses than servants now. The merchant pauses to let this sink in, then continues with the systematic precision of a man reading from a very long list. The Count of Toulouse, dead. The Earl of Chester, dead. The Duke of Burgundy, dead. Half the nobles in France are either dead, dying, or running like rabbits to their country estates, where they're dying anyway. This is roughly equivalent to hearing that all the tech billionaires, Hollywood celebrities, and political leaders of today just dropped dead simultaneously from the same disease, while the janitors and grocery store clerks kept working. The natural order isn't just being challenged, it's being completely inverted. But here's the truly delicious irony. The very wealth and privilege that these nobles spent centuries accumulating has made them perfect targets for the plague. Their magnificent stone castles, those symbols of eternal power and divine favor, have become death traps more efficiently designed than anything the most creative medieval torturer could devise. Think about it. While you live in a one-room hovel with your family, barely scraping by, the nobility live in massive structures filled with hundreds of people's servants, guards, courtiers, guests, and hangers, on all crammed together in what amounts to medieval apartment complexes. When one person gets sick in a castle, the disease spreads through the population faster than gossip at a high school reunion. Their elaborate social rituals, once seen as proof of their superiority, have become vectors for infection. The formal dinners where dozens of nobles gather to display their wealth and power, perfect opportunities for respiratory droplets to mingle with the wine. The grand ceremonies where everyone kisses the Lord's ring or hand, might as well call it a pandemic party with medieval catering. And their medicine, their medicine is spectacularly counterproductive. While you make do with herbal remedies and the occasional bloodletting by the village barber, the nobility can afford the finest physicians in Europe. These learned doctors, trained in the great universities of Paris and Bologna, arrive with their elaborate theories about celestial influences and humoral imbalances, their expensive treatments and sophisticated procedures. The results are hilariously awful. The rich get sicker faster because their physicians are more aggressively wrong, while your local barber might content himself with a modest bloodletting. These university-trained experts perform elaborate procedures involving mercury, arsenic, and other exotic poisons that were expensive enough to seem therapeutic. They prescribe ground pearls, powdered unicorn horn, and other fantastically costly remedies that do absolutely nothing except empty the patient's treasury before emptying their veins. The psychological impact on the surviving nobility is perhaps even more devastating than the physical disease. These people have spent their entire lives believing that their elevated status reflected divine approval, that their wealth and power proved God's favor. The peasants were poor because they deserved to be poor. The nobles were rich because they deserved to be rich. It was cosmic justice, as natural and inevitable as the sunrise. But plague doesn't read social registers. Bacteria don't check your coat of arms before deciding whether to infect you. The same black boils that disfigure peasant flesh look exactly the same on aristocratic skin. The same fever that kills a serf burns just as hot in noble veins. Death, it turns out, is the ultimate egalitarian. Some nobles respond to this revelation with the kind of frantic religious hysteria that would make televangelists proud. They throw themselves into extreme penance, convinced that their suffering must be punishment for some hidden sin. They donate vast sums to the church, or what's left of it, hoping to buy divine protection through charitable works. They organize elaborate processions of flagellants, marching through their territories while whipping themselves bloody, as if physical suffering could somehow balance the cosmic scales. Others go in the opposite direction entirely, embracing a philosophy that would fit right in at a modern Vegas bachelor party. If we're all going to die anyway, why not enjoy ourselves while we can? Noble courts that once prided themselves on refined behavior and Christian virtue transform into scenes of debauchery that would make Roman emperors blush. If traditional morality can't protect you from plague, then maybe traditional morality is just another lie the powerful tell to control the powerless. The economic implications are staggering. When the Duke of Lancaster dies along with most of his household, who inherits his lands? His eldest son died a week before him. His second son died 2 days after. His brother, his nephews, his male cousins, the entire line of succession has been wiped out faster than you can say. Inheritance tax. Suddenly, vast estates that have been in the same noble families for centuries are up for grabs. Distant relatives emerge from obscurity, claiming dubious blood ties to dead dukes. Ambitious knights and minor nobles see opportunities to advance their positions in ways that would have been impossible just months earlier. The rigid social hierarchy that seemed as permanent as stone begins to crack and shift like a house built on sand. But perhaps the most significant change is happening in the minds of the survivors, including you. For your entire life, you've been taught that the social order reflects divine will, that questioning the authority of your betters is tantamount to questioning God himself. The Lord's right to rule, the noble's right to your labor, the entire system of feudal obligation. It was all sanctified by scripture and tradition, as unchangeable as the movement of the stars. Now you've watched that same system fail spectacularly. The lords who were supposed to protect you fled at the first sign of danger. The nobles who claimed divine favor died just as miserably as any peasant. The priests who proclaimed gods, couldn't explain why God was apparently willing his most faithful servants into black, boiled oblivion. The merchant finishes his litany of noble deaths and looks around at your small group of survivors with something approaching wonder. "You know what's strange?" he says. "The further you get from the cities, the better your chances. The poorer your village, the more people survive. It's like God decided to start over, and he's keeping the humble while clearing out the proud." This observation hits you with the force of divine revelation. For the first time in your life, being at the bottom of the social pyramid might actually be an advantage. Your poverty, your isolation, your simple way of life, these aren't punishments or signs of divine disfavor. They're survival strategies. The natural order isn't just breaking down, it's inverting entirely. The meek might actually inherit the earth not through divine grace in the afterlife, but through simple biological advantages in this one. And if that's true, then everything else you thought you knew about power, authority, and social order might be wrong too. The survivors of this plague won't just rebuild the old world, they'll have the opportunity to build something entirely new. The question is, what kind of world will that be? Welcome to the most unexpected plot twist in medieval history. Suddenly, you matter. It's the autumn of 1348, and approximately half of Europe is dead. The other half is trying very hard not to join them, which has created what modern economists would call a significant labor market disruption. But you don't need a PhD in economics to understand what's happening. For the first time in your adult life, there are more jobs than people to fill them. Think about this for a moment. Yesterday you were disposable, replaceable. If you died, got sick, or simply annoyed your lord too much, there were dozens of other desperate peasants ready to take your place. You worked for whatever scraps your betters decided to throw you, and you were grateful for the privilege. Complaining about working conditions was like complaining about the weather, pointless, dangerous, and likely to get you labeled as a troublemaker. Today, you're a valuable commodity, a limited resource, a hot property in the medieval equivalent of a seller's market. The transformation starts with something as simple as breakfast. You wake up in your cottage, which, by the way, now feels positively spacious since 3 of your family members died last spring, and discover that nobody has come to collect you for the day's labor. This is unprecedented. For your entire adult life, the Lord's bailiff has appeared at dawn to march you and the other serfs to whatever field needed tending. It was as reliable as sunrise, as inevitable as taxes, but the bailiff died in July. His replacement died in August. The replacement's replacement ran away to his cousin's village, where the plague supposedly hadn't reached yet. Nobody has been assigned to organize the remaining peasants, which means nobody has been working the Lord's fields for the past 2 weeks. You venture outside and find a scene that would have been impossible to imagine just months ago. The Lord's vast wheat fields, which should have been harvested by now, stand untouched under the autumn's sun. Tons of grain worth more than your entire village could earn in a decade are slowly rotting, while the handful of surviving peasants wonder if anyone is going to tell them what to do. This is the moment when you realize something extraordinary. They need you more than you need them. The revelation comes when Sir Edmund, the Lord's younger brother, who inherited the estate after everyone higher in the succession died of plague, arrives from his manor house looking like a man who hasn't slept in weeks. He surveys the unharvested fields with the expression of someone watching their life savings catch fire, then turns to the small group of surviving peasants with something you've never seen in a noble's eyes before: desperation. right? He says, clearly making this up as he goes along. We need to get this grain harvested. Everyone who works gets... He pauses, visibly calculating how little he can get away with offering. Everyone gets their usual allowance. The silence that follows is so profound you can hear individual leaves falling from trees. Finally, old Henrik, who's not actually that old, maybe 45, but seems ancient by medieval standards, clears his throat. Begging your pardon, my lord, but what's our usual allowance exactly? Sir Edmund looks confused. Your usual allowance, what you always get. Which is what we need to survive. Henrik continues with the patience of a teacher, explaining basic math to a slow student. But now, there's half as many of us doing twice as much work. Seems like the allowance should reflect that, don't you think? This is the moment you realize that Henrik has just done something unprecedented in the 1,000-year history of European feudalism. He's negotiated. Sir Edmund's face goes through a fascinating progression of emotions: confusion, indignation, calculation, and finally a grudging understanding that the old rules no longer apply. Fine, he says through gritted teeth. Double rations for everyone who works the harvest. But Henrik isn't finished, and we'll need time to tend our own plots. Can't work your fields and ours too, not with so few hands left. And we'll need freedom to sell our surplus crops at market, adds Maria, the miller's widow, apparently emboldened by this new spirit of labor activism. No point growing extra food if we can't profit from it. And you hear yourself saying, surprised by the sound of your own voice? We'll need to be free to leave if we find better opportunities elsewhere. The words hang in the air like a challenge to the natural order itself. For centuries, being tied to the land has been the defining feature of peasant life. You were born on your lord's estate, you worked his fields, you died on his property, and your children inherited the same obligations. It was serfdom, not quite slavery, but not quite freedom either. But Sir Edmund, looking at his rotting grain and his handful of irreplaceable workers, nods slowly. Agreed, he says, probably wondering how he's going to explain this to his noble relatives. But first, the harvest. And just like that, you've become a free wage laborer. The transformation is so sudden, so complete, that it takes days for the full implications to sink in. You're not just working for survival anymore, you're working for profit. You can negotiate your terms, demand better conditions, even quit if you find a better offer. The psychological shift is enormous. Yesterday, you approached your lord with your head bowed, your cap in your hands, your entire posture expressing submission and deference. Today, you walk into his presence with your shoulders straight, meeting his eyes, speaking your mind. Not as an equal, that would be pushing things too far, but as someone whose opinion matters, whose cooperation is essential. Other surviving lords in the region are facing the same crisis, and word spreads quickly through the network of surviving peasants. The Baron of Westford is offering triple rations and permission to keep chickens on his land. The Earl of Northbridge is promising his workers a share of the profits from any surplus crops they produce. Some desperate nobles are even offering to pay their workers in actual silver coins, transforming peasants into something resembling modern employees. The competition for your labor becomes so intense that you start to feel like a medieval free agent in the world's first labor market. Lords who wouldn't have acknowledged your existence a year ago are now sending messages through intermediaries, making offers, trying to poach you from your current employer. You've gone from invisible to indispensable in the span of a single plague season. But the real transformation isn't economic, it's psychological. For the first time in your life, you have choices. Real choices with real consequences. You can stay where you are, or you can leave. You can accept the offered terms, or you can negotiate better ones. You can work for a traditional lord who still clings to feudal obligations, or you can seek out one of the more progressive nobles who's adapting to the new reality. This power is intoxicating. After decades of having every aspect of your life controlled by others, suddenly you're making decisions that affect your own destiny. It's like discovering you can fly after spending your entire life assuming you were meant to crawl. The social implications ripple outward like stones dropped in still water. When peasants can choose their employers, employers have to compete for peasants. When workers can demand better conditions, working conditions improve. When people can move freely, the entire concept of being tied to the land becomes meaningless. Traditional feudal obligations start crumbling faster than poorly maintained castle walls. Lords who insist that their surviving peasants still owe them unpaid labor find themselves farming empty fields. Nobles who refuse to negotiate discover that their workers have simply vanished overnight, heading for better opportunities elsewhere. The smart lords adapt quickly. They transform feudal obligations into wage relationships, replace traditional payments in kind with actual money, and start treating their peasants more like employees than property. The stubborn ones find themselves presiding over empty estates, their crops rotting in the fields while they argue with empty air about the divine right of kings. You personally experience this transformation when Sir Edmund approaches you with an offer that would have been inconceivable just months earlier. "I want you to oversee the spring planting," he says, not as a command, but as a request. You know the land better than anyone, and you understand what needs to be done. I'll pay you a percentage of whatever we harvest, plus a house of your own and first choice of plots for your family's use. The position he's offering is essentially that of farm manager, a role that would traditionally go to a minor noble or wealthy freeman, never to a serf. But traditional qualifications matter less than practical experience when most of the traditionally qualified people are dead. You accept the offer, naturally. Why wouldn't you? For the first time in your life, you have the opportunity to build something for yourself and your children. Not just to survive, but to prosper. Not just to endure your circumstances, but to shape them. The medieval world hasn't just changed, it's been turned completely upside down. The people who were once at the bottom of the social pyramid suddenly find themselves in positions of unprecedented power and opportunity. And this is just the beginning. The economic transformation you're experiencing is about to trigger changes in every aspect of medieval society. Changes that will reshape European civilization for centuries to come. But first, you have fields to plant and a new life to build. After all, revolution is hard work, even when it comes disguised as a labor shortage. By the spring of 1349, you're witnessing something that would make modern economists weep tears of pure confusion, an economy where supply and demand have completely lost their minds. Picture this. You're walking through what used to be the prosperous market town of Millbrook, about a day's journey from your village. Before the plague, this place buzzed with activity. Merchants hawking their wares, craftsmen displaying their skills, farmers selling their produce, and enough people to make the whole enterprise profitable. It was the medieval equivalent of a busy shopping mall, except with more mud and fewer chain stores. Now it looks like the aftermath of a zombie apocalypse, if zombies were particularly interested in economic disruption. The cobbler's shop stands open, its door creaking in the wind. Inside, you find dozens of finished shoes sitting on shelves, representing months of skilled labor and expensive materials. Their beautiful shoes, soft leather, expert stitching, the kind of craftsmanship that would normally cost a peasant several months' wages. But the cobbler is dead, his family is dead, and most of his potential customers are dead too. So the shoes just sit there, gathering dust, waiting for feet that will never come. You could take them. All of them. Who's going to stop you? The sheriff died in the second wave of infections. The mayor died in the third. The town constable ran away when his wife started coughing up blood. There's literally no one left with the authority to arrest you for theft. And even if there were, what jury would convict you? Half the potential jurors are dead, and the other half are probably too busy trying to survive to care about property rights. This is the new reality of post-plague economics. There's more stuff than people to use it, and traditional concepts of ownership have become about as relevant as a snowball in hell. The bakery tells the same story. The ovens are cold, but the building still smells faintly of bread and cinnamon. The baker's tools expensive, well maintained, representing a lifetime of investment, lie scattered across the work surfaces like toys abandoned by a child called away to dinner. Except the child is never coming back. You could set up shop here tomorrow. You don't know how to bake bread professionally, but honestly, how hard could it be? And even if your bread is terrible, you'd have a monopoly on the local market. Competition is remarkably light when most of your competitors are dead. The merchant's stall reveals perhaps the most bizarre sight of all. Actual money, just lying there in the open. Silver coins scattered across the counter, a small chest of gold pieces tucked under the main table. A purse of copper pennies hanging from a hook like fruit nobody bothered to pick. The merchant probably died trying to count his profits, and now those profits belong to whoever is brave enough to claim them. This is the medieval equivalent of finding a briefcase full of cash in an abandoned airport, except the airport is the entire European economy, and the briefcase is everywhere you look. But here's the truly surreal part: the money is almost worthless. You could fill your pockets with silver coins and still not be able to buy a decent meal, because there's nobody left to sell you food. You could claim the entire contents of the goldsmith shop and still go hungry, because gold can't plant crops or milk cows or turn grain into bread. For the first time in European history, there's a surplus of currency and a shortage of absolutely everything else that matters. The irony is delicious. Merchants spent centuries accumulating wealth, convinced that money was the key to security and happiness. Now their carefully hoarded fortunes lie worthless in empty shops, while the survivors scramble for basic necessities that money can't buy. But you're starting to see opportunities that go beyond simple scavenging. The economic disruption isn't just destroying the old system, it's creating space for entirely new ways of organizing society. Take the textile trade, for instance. Before the plague, cloth production was controlled by powerful guilds that regulated everything from who could weave fabric to how much they could charge for it. Master weavers guarded their secrets jealously. Apprentices served for years before earning the right to practice their craft, and the whole system was designed to limit competition and maintain high prices. Now most of the guild masters are dead, their workshops stand empty, and their precious trade secrets died with them. But the demand for cloth hasn't disappeared. If anything, it's increased. Because people need new clothes to replace the garments of the dead, and nobody wants to wear clothing that might still carry the plague. You could walk into any abandoned weaving shop, claim the equipment, and start your own cloth business. No guild approval required, No lengthy apprenticeship. No permission from established masters. Just you, some looms, and whatever skills you can develop through trial and error. The same principle applies to dozens of other trades: blacksmithing, carpentry, pottery, leatherworking, all the skilled crafts that once required years of training and guild membership to practice legally. The legal barriers have collapsed along with the institutions that enforced them. It's like someone took the medieval equivalent of professional licensing requirements and threw them all in a bonfire. This creates what modern economists would call unprecedented social mobility. People who were born into peasant families can suddenly become merchants, craftsmen, even minor nobles if they're clever enough to claim the right abandoned properties. The rigid caste system that kept everyone in their predetermined place for centuries has been shattered like a dropped wine jug. Your neighbor's son, young Thomas, exemplifies this transformation. Before the plague, Thomas was destined for a life of agricultural labor, just like his father and grandfather before him. His prospects were limited to inheriting his family's small plot of land and maybe, if he was very lucky, saving enough money to buy a pig. Now Thomas has moved into the abandoned manor house of a minor noble who died without heirs. He's claimed the lord's lands, livestock, and even his title, declaring himself Lord Thomas of Millbrook with the same casual confidence that someone might claim a vacant parking space. And why not? There's nobody left to dispute his claim, and somebody needs to organize the agricultural production in the region. The transformation is so complete that when you meet Thomas at the weekly market, which now consists of maybe 6 people trading goods in the ruins of what used to be a bustling commercial center, he greets you as an equal, not as a peasant addressing his betters, but as one landowner speaking to another. "Good morning, friend," he says, using the formal address that was once reserved for interactions between social equals. "I trust your harvest preparations are proceeding well." This is the same Thomas who used to bow and scrape whenever he encountered anyone above his station. Now he's speaking to you with the dignity and confidence of someone who owns land, employs workers, and makes decisions that affect other people's lives. The conversation that follows would have been impossible in the old world. You discuss crop rotation strategies, labor management, market prices, and investment opportunities. You're not just surviving anymore. You're planning for the future, making calculations about profit and loss, thinking like entrepreneurs rather than serfs. The meeting ends with Thomas making you an offer that crystallizes the new reality. "I'm planning to establish a grain mill on my property. I need a partner who understands the local farming conditions and can help manage the operation." Interested in a joint venture. A joint venture between 2 people who were born peasants, who never owned anything more valuable than a plow and a pair of oxen, who lived their entire lives under the absolute authority of their social betters. You accept his offer naturally. Why wouldn't you? The old world is dead, and the new world belongs to whoever is bold enough to claim it. But as you walk home through the empty streets of Millbrook, passing abandoned shops and ownerless treasures, you can't shake the feeling that you're living through the end of one civilization and the beginning of another. The coins scattered across the merchant's counter aren't just money. They're symbols of an entire economic system that has collapsed so completely that its medium of exchange has become decorative objects. The empty shops aren't just buildings, they're the physical remnants of a social order that no longer exists. And you, a former serf who now owns land, employs workers, and makes business deals with other entrepreneurs. You're not just a survivor of the plague. You're a pioneer in a new world where birth doesn't determine destiny, where social mobility is limited only by imagination and courage, where the rigid hierarchies of the past have been replaced by the fluid opportunities of the future. The medieval world is dead. Something new is being born to take its place. And for the first time in your life, you get to help decide what that something will be. Here's something that would have made medieval churchmen spontaneously combust by the summer of 1349. Women across Europe are making decisions. Not the small, domestic decisions they were always allowed to make, like whether to serve turnip soup, or barley porridge for dinner, or which child to send to bed without eating when food runs short. Real decisions. Life-changing decisions. Business decisions. Decisions that affect other people's lives and their own futures. For the first time in European history, women have leverage. Let's start with your sister Margaret, who before the plague lived the kind of life that medieval society designed specifically for women like her. She married young, barely 16, to a farmer chosen by your father in consultation with the local lord. Her husband, Robert, was a decent enough man by medieval standards, which means he only beat her when he was very drunk and never sold any of her belongings without asking first. Margaret's role was beautifully simple: produce children, maintain the household, and support her husband's agricultural work. She had no legal rights to property, no say in family decisions, and no options if the marriage went badly. Her identity was completely absorbed into her husband's. She went from being Margaret, daughter of William, to Margaret, wife of Robert, without ever being just Margaret. This arrangement worked perfectly well for everyone except Margaret, but nobody particularly cared about Margaret's opinion on the subject. Then Robert died of plague in the spring of 1349, along with 2 of their 3 children. According to traditional law and custom, Margaret should have been absorbed back into her father's household. If he was still alive, which he wasn't, or married off quickly to another man who could manage her late husband's property. Women, after all, were not considered capable of handling complex matters like farming, business, or making decisions more complicated than what to have for breakfast. But there's a problem with this traditional arrangement. There aren't enough men left to marry all the widows. The plague killed men and women roughly equally, but it created a situation where the surviving men have their pick of opportunities. Why would a healthy young man want to marry a widow with children and take on the responsibility of managing her dead husband's debts when he could claim abandoned land elsewhere and start fresh? Why tie yourself down with someone else's obligations when you could write your own ticket in the new economy? So Margaret finds herself in an unprecedented situation. Nobody is forcing her to remarry, and nobody is capable of forcing her to give up her late husband's property. For the first time in her adult life, she's making her own decisions. The transformation begins with something as simple as refusing a marriage proposal. Sir Geoffrey, one of the few surviving minor nobles in the area, approaches Margaret with what he considers a generous offer. He'll marry her, take over management of her lands, and allow her to continue living in her own house. Basically, he'll graciously permit her to exist in exchange for legal control over everything she owns. In the old world, this would have been an excellent arrangement. Margaret would have gained protection, social status, and economic security. Sir Geoffrey would have gained land, livestock, and a competent housekeeper. Everyone wins, according to medieval logic. But Margaret looks at Sir Geoffrey, a man 20 years older than her, with a reputation for drinking too much and hitting his servants, and says something that hasn't been heard much in European history. No, Thank you. Sir Geoffrey is genuinely confused. I'm sorry, what did you say? I said no. I don't want to marry you. But you have to marry someone. You can't manage this property alone. You're a woman. Margaret considers this argument for exactly 3 seconds. Watch me? And she does. Margaret takes over the full management of her late husband's farm, making all the decisions that men were supposedly born to make. She negotiates with the Lord's steward about rent payments. She hires workers for the harvest. She decides which fields to plant and which to leave fallow. She takes her grain to market and haggles over prices with merchants who initially try to cheat her because she's female, then quickly learn that Margaret knows exactly what her crops are worth. The results are spectacular. Within a year, Margaret's farm is more prosperous than it ever was under her husband's management. Not because she's necessarily a better farmer than Robert was, but because she has more freedom to make decisions quickly without consulting anyone else. When she sees an opportunity, she takes it. When she spots a problem, she fixes it. No committees, no permissions, no waiting for someone else to make up their mind. Margaret's success inspires other widows throughout the region. Women who were told their entire lives that they were incapable of handling men's work discover that they're actually quite good at it. Businesses that might have closed after their male owners died are instead taken over by widows who prove remarkably capable of keeping them running. The economic implications are staggering. In a world where labor shortages make every capable person valuable, society can't afford to exclude half the population from productive work. Women who were previously limited to domestic roles suddenly find themselves working as merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and even money lenders. But the real revolution isn't economic, it's psychological. Women who spend a year or two managing their own affairs, making their own decisions, and experiencing financial independence develop something that medieval society tried very hard to prevent confidence. Take young Emma, the blacksmith's daughter. Before the plague, Emma helped her father in his workshop, but only with simple tasks like maintaining the fire or organizing tools. The actual smithing, the skilled work of shaping metal, was reserved for men. It was too physically demanding for women, too technically complex, too important to trust to female capabilities. When Emma's father dies, she has two choices: close the smithy and try to find some other way to survive, or figure out how to do the work herself. She chooses the second option, partly because she needs the income, but mostly because she's tired of being told what she can't do. The learning curve is steep. Blacksmithing is genuinely difficult work that requires strength, skill, and experience. But Emma has been watching her father work for years. She understands the principles, and she's motivated by the kind of desperation that makes people capable of extraordinary things. Within 6 months, Emma is producing horseshoes, farm tools, and household items that are every bit as good as her father's work. Within a year, she's innovating, developing new techniques and more efficient methods. She's not just maintaining her father's business, she's improving it. The social consequences ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. When women prove they can do men's work, the justifications for excluding them from that work start to look pretty flimsy. When women demonstrate competence in business, the idea that they're naturally unsuited for commerce becomes harder to maintain. Churches across Europe find themselves grappling with theological questions they never expected to face. If God created women to be subordinate to men, why has He allowed them to succeed so spectacularly in positions of independence? If female weakness and irrationality are natural facts, Why are so many women proving to be strong and rational when given the opportunity? Some priests adapt by developing new interpretations of scripture that emphasize women's spiritual equality while maintaining traditional social roles. Others double down on conservative theology, insisting that the current crisis is temporary and that natural order will reassert itself once the plague ends. But the most significant change is happening in the minds of women themselves. Margaret, Emma, and thousands of others like them are experiencing something that previous generations of European women could barely imagine: the knowledge that they're capable of directing their own lives. This confidence manifests in ways both large and small. Women start speaking up in village meetings, offering opinions on community decisions. They form business partnerships with each other, creating networks of female entrepreneurs who support and advise one another. They negotiate marriage contracts that preserve their property rights and personal autonomy. Some even choose not to remarry at all, preferring independence to the legal subjugation that marriage traditionally entailed. This is perhaps the most radical development of all: women voluntarily remaining single, not because they can't find husbands, but because they prefer the freedom of being responsible only to themselves. The transformation affects family structures too. When women have economic independence, they can make choices about childbearing based on their own desires rather than their husband's demands. When women control property, they can pass it on to their daughters as well as their sons. When women have decision-making power, children grow up seeing female authority as normal rather than exceptional. By 1350, the social landscape has changed so dramatically that young people coming of age have no memory of the old constraints. Girls who grow up watching their mothers run businesses, make financial decisions, and exercise authority naturally assume that these opportunities will be available to them too. The medieval concept of gender roles hasn't disappeared entirely. That would take centuries more. But it has been fundamentally shaken. The idea that women are naturally incapable of handling responsibility, making decisions, or managing complex tasks has been empirically disproven on a continent-wide scale. And once that kind of assumption is challenged by reality, it becomes very difficult to put back together again. Margaret, still successfully managing her farm and firmly declining all marriage proposals, probably doesn't realize that she's part of a social revolution. She's just trying to build a good life for herself and her surviving daughter. But her daily choices, to negotiate her own contracts, make her own decisions, and live on her own terms, are helping to create a world where other women will have opportunities that previous generations could never have imagined. The medieval world didn't just lose half its population to plague. It lost the entire system of assumptions about what different kinds of people were capable of accomplishing. And some of those assumptions, once broken, would never be repaired. By 1350, the European urban landscape looks like someone took a map of medieval civilization, threw it in a blender, and then tried to reassemble the pieces while blindfolded and slightly drunk. Cities that had dominated European commerce and politics for centuries are suddenly ghost towns, their magnificent cathedrals echoing with emptiness instead of prayers, their bustling marketplaces reduced to collections of abandoned stalls where weeds grow through the cobblestones. Meanwhile, obscure villages that nobody had heard of 5 years ago are transforming into thriving commercial centers, seemingly overnight. You're witnessing the greatest urban reorganization in European history, and the best part, nobody planned any of it. Take Florence, for instance, that jewel of medieval Italy, home to the Medici banking empire and some of the finest art and architecture in Europe. Before the plague, Florence was basically the Manhattan of the medieval world, wealthy, influential, and absolutely convinced of its own permanent importance. The city's population peaked at around 100,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centers north of the Alps. Then the plague arrived like a particularly efficient urban planning consultant with a very dark sense of humor. By 1351, Florence's population had dropped to roughly 40,000. The banking houses that had financed kings and emperors found themselves with more dead customers than living ones. The textile workshops that had clothed half of Europe stood empty because there weren't enough workers to operate the looms. The city that had been synonymous with wealth and sophistication was suddenly struggling to maintain basic services. Garbage piled up in the streets because there weren't enough sanitation workers. Crime flourished because there weren't enough guards. Trade declined because there weren't enough merchants, craftsmen, or customers to sustain the complex commercial networks that had made Florence prosperous. But here's where the story gets interesting. Florence's loss became other cities' gain. While established urban centers struggled with demographic collapse, smaller towns with natural advantages, good harbors, strategic locations along trade routes, access to raw materials, suddenly found themselves with opportunities their leaders had never dared to imagine. Consider the rise of Antwerp, which before the plague was just another minor Flemish trading post that most Europeans couldn't have found on a map with a team of Sherpa guides. Antwerp had always been overshadowed by Bruges, the grand old lady of northern European commerce, whose merchants controlled the wool trade and whose bankers financed half the wars in Europe. But Bruges got hit particularly hard by the plague, partly because its wealth and density made it an ideal breeding ground for disease, and partly because its complex trade relationships collapsed when key partners in other cities died faster than they could be replaced. The sophisticated commercial networks that had made Bruges wealthy proved to be extremely fragile when the people who managed them started dying en masse. Antwerp, being smaller and less established, was also more flexible. When Flemish wool merchants needed a new base of operations, Antwerp was ready. When English traders needed a continental port for their expanded commerce, Antwerp had available dock space. When German craftsmen fled plague, devastated cities, Antwerp offered them workshops and homes. Within a decade, Antwerp had transformed from a sleepy provincial town into one of the most important commercial centers in northern Europe. The city's population tripled, its harbor expanded, and its merchants began handling trade volumes that would have made their Bruges competitors weep with envy if any of those competitors had survived to do the weeping. This pattern repeated across the continent with the predictable regularity of a natural law. Established cities with rigid social structures, complex guild systems, and deeply entrenched power hierarchies found it difficult to adapt to post-plague realities. Smaller, more flexible communities were able to pivot quickly, taking advantage of new opportunities and attracting displaced populations. Venice provides perhaps the most fascinating example of urban adaptation. Unlike Florence or Bruges, Venice actually benefited from the plague's effects on its competitors. The city's unique geography, built on islands in a lagoon, had always made it somewhat isolated, which during the plague years turned out to be a significant advantage. Venice lost population like everywhere else, but proportionally less than most major urban centers. More importantly, Venice's maritime orientation meant that when overland trade routes were disrupted by demographic collapse, the city was perfectly positioned to expand its sea-based commerce. Venetian merchants moved quickly to fill the gaps left by deceased competitors, establishing new trading relationships and exploring markets that had previously been dominated by now defunct commercial houses. The result was that Venice emerged from the plague years stronger and more influential than ever, eventually becoming the dominant commercial power in the Mediterranean for the next 2 centuries. But the most dramatic urban transformation was happening in places that hadn't been cities at all before the plague. You experience this firsthand when you decide to explore commercial opportunities beyond your own region. Following rumors of profitable trade in the north, you make your way to what had been, just 5 years earlier, a small fishing village on the North Sea coast. The village had maybe 300 residents, most of whom made their living pulling cod out of the ocean and occasionally trading fish for grain with inland farmers. What you find when you arrive is something unprecedented, a boom town. The harbor, which used to accommodate maybe a dozen fishing boats, has been expanded to handle merchant vessels from across northern Europe. New warehouses line the waterfront, storing goods from as far away as the Baltic and the Mediterranean. The population has swelled to over 2,000 people, most of them recent arrivals seeking opportunities that no longer exist in their plague, devastated hometowns. The transformation is so complete that you barely recognize the place. Streets that used to be muddy paths between fishermen's cottages have been paved with stone. New buildings are going up faster than the carpenters can finish them. Markets that once sold nothing but fish and basic supplies now offer silk from Italy, furs from Russia, and spices from places whose names you can't even pronounce. What happened here is a perfect example of how the plague reshuffled Europe's urban hierarchy. When larger, more established ports lost their workforces and their commercial networks, trade had to find new routes and new centers. This little fishing village happened to be in the right place at the right time, with a good natural harbor and a population small enough to absorb newcomers without too much social friction. The village's original residents, those who survived the plague, found themselves in possession of something they'd never imagined they could own. Prime real estate in a major commercial center. Fishermen who had never owned anything more valuable than a boat and a net suddenly found themselves landlords, renting property to merchant families who were willing to pay extraordinary sums for the privilege of establishing businesses in this new hub of trade. Old Henrik, whom you remember as a simple fisherman struggling to feed his family, greets you wearing clothes that would have been suitable for a minor noble just a few years ago. "Welcome to New Harbor," he says with obvious pride, using the name the growing city has adopted to distinguish itself from its humble origins. Looking for business opportunities, are you? Well, you've come to the right place. The conversation that follows reveals the full scope of the transformation. Henrik now owns 6 buildings in the commercial district, which he rents to merchants, craftsmen, and traders. He's invested in 2 merchant vessels that carry goods between New Harbor and other emerging commercial centers. He's even considering a partnership with a group of Italian bankers who want to establish a branch office in the city. This is the same Henrik who 5 years ago would have considered himself wealthy if he caught enough fish to feed his family through the winter. The social dynamics of these new cities are fundamentally different from those of traditional urban centers. In established cities like Paris or Milan, social hierarchies had been rigid for centuries. The patrician families controlled commerce, the guild masters controlled crafts, and the church controlled everything else. Social mobility was limited, opportunities were restricted, and innovation was often discouraged because it threatened established interests. But in the new boom towns rising from the ashes of the old world, social hierarchies are fluid and merit matters more than birth. Henrik's transformation from fisherman to landlord and investor isn't unusual. It's typical. The plague created so many opportunities for advancement that anyone with intelligence, ambition, and a little luck could dramatically improve their circumstances. These new cities also attract different kinds of people. Instead of being dominated by traditional elites who inherited their positions, they're filled with entrepreneurs, risk-takers, and innovators who are actively creating new forms of commerce and social organization. The atmosphere is dynamic, optimistic, and remarkably open to new ideas. The political implications are enormous. For centuries, European politics had been dominated by a relatively small number of major cities whose wealth and influence gave them disproportionate power in regional and international affairs. When those cities lost population and economic strength, their political influence declined accordingly. The new commercial centers that emerged from the plague years brought fresh perspectives to European politics. They were less bound by traditional alliances, more focused on practical concerns like trade and commerce, and more willing to experiment with new forms of governance that emphasized economic growth over aristocratic privilege. By 1355, the map of European commerce looks completely different than it did in 1345. Some cities that had dominated trade for centuries have become regional backwaters. Others that had been minor provincial towns are now major commercial centers. Entirely new cities have appeared seemingly from nowhere, challenging the dominance of established urban hierarchies. And through it all, ordinary people like you and Henrik have found opportunities for advancement that would have been impossible under the old system. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the rigid social structures that had kept most Europeans trapped in the circumstances of their birth. The new urban landscape emerging from the demographic catastrophe is more dynamic, more meritocratic, and more open to innovation than anything Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. The medieval world's urban hierarchy, like so many other aspects of medieval civilization, has been permanently transformed, and the cities that emerge as winners in this great reshuffling will shape European development for centuries to come. There's something profoundly ironic about the fact that Europe's greatest cultural flowering began in a pile of corpses. It's now 1352, and you've survived the worst pandemic in human history. You've watched friends, family members, and neighbors die in ways that medieval medicine couldn't explain and medieval theology couldn't justify. You've seen the collapse of social institutions that claim to be eternal, the failure of religious authorities who promised divine protection, and the complete breakdown of a worldview that insisted everything happened according to God's perfect plan. And here's the strange thing: instead of breaking you, this experience has made you curious. For the first time in your life, you're asking questions that would have been considered dangerous heresy just a few years ago. Not because you've lost your faith entirely, but because watching thousands of people die horrible deaths has forced you to reconsider some very basic assumptions about how the world actually works. The transformation begins with something as simple as reading. Before the plague, books were rare, expensive, and largely controlled by the church. The average village might have contained a dozen people who could read at all, and most of them were clergy. Literacy was a specialized skill, like blacksmithing or surgery, reserved for people whose jobs specifically required it. The idea that a common person might read for pleasure or to satisfy intellectual curiosity was as foreign as the concept of space travel. But the plague changed everything, including the book market. Monasteries that had spent centuries accumulating libraries suddenly found themselves short-staffed and desperate for revenue. Monks who had devoted their lives to copying manuscripts were either dead or reassigned to more pressing duties like burying the bodies that kept piling up outside monastery walls. The carefully guarded collections of classical texts, theological commentaries, and philosophical treatises that had been the exclusive domain of learned clergy were suddenly available to anyone with enough silver to make a reasonable offer. You encounter this new literary marketplace when you visit what remains of the Abbey of Saint Benedict, about 2 days' journey from your village. The abbey was once home to over 200 monks who devoted their lives to prayer, study, and the meticulous copying of ancient texts. Now it houses maybe 30 survivors, most of them too old or too sick to maintain the rigorous schedule of religious observance that had defined monastic life for centuries. Brother Thomas, the abbey's librarian, greets you with the hollow-eyed expression of a man who has spent too many months burying his colleagues. We're liquidating parts of our collection. He explains with the matter of fact tone that people use when discussing tragedies too large to process emotionally. The Abbey needs funds for basic maintenance, and honestly, we don't have enough brothers left to properly care for all these manuscripts. What follows is essentially a medieval book sale, except the books for sale include works that were previously considered too dangerous, too complex, or too valuable for anyone outside the church hierarchy to own. You find yourself looking at texts that would have been absolutely forbidden to people like you just a few years ago. Aristotle's works on natural philosophy, Plato's dialogues on government and society, Roman histories that describe civilizations organized very differently from medieval Europe. There are medical texts that explain human anatomy in ways that contradict church teaching, astronomical works that suggest the Earth might not be the center of the universe, and philosophical treatises that question the relationship between reason and faith. The prices are remarkably reasonable. Brother Thomas is clearly more concerned with finding these books good homes than with maximizing profit. Take the Aristotle. He says, when you express interest in a collection of the philosopher's works, half a dozen of our brothers died before they could finish copying it, and there's nobody left who has the time to complete the project. Better that it should go to someone who will actually read it than sit here gathering dust. You purchase several volumes, including works by classical authors whose names you recognize, but whose ideas you've never encountered directly. It's like gaining access to a conversation that has been going on for over 1,000 years, but which you were previously excluded from hearing. The experience of reading these ancient texts is genuinely revolutionary. Not because they provide easy answers to difficult questions, but because they demonstrate that people have been asking difficult questions for centuries and coming up with radically different answers than the ones you've been taught to accept without question. Take Aristotle's approach to natural philosophy, for instance. Instead of beginning with religious doctrine and trying to fit observations into predetermined theological frameworks, Aristotle starts with careful observation of the natural world and tries to develop explanations based on logic and evidence. It's a completely different way of thinking about how knowledge is acquired and validated. Or consider Plato's political philosophy, which describes forms of government based on rational principles rather than divine appointment. The idea that human societies could be organized according to philosophical theories rather than traditional hierarchies is mined, blowing for someone raised in a feudal system where social order was considered to be directly ordained by God. These aren't just academic curiosities. They're practical tools for understanding and potentially reshaping the world around you. The intellectual transformation is accelerated by conversations with other survivors who are going through similar processes of questioning and discovery. The plague has created an entire generation of Europeans who have personally witnessed the failure of traditional authorities and are actively searching for alternative ways of understanding their experiences. You meet Master Giovanni, an Italian merchant who fled his plague, devastated hometown, and ended up settling in your region. Giovanni had received a classical education before the plague, unusual for a merchant, but his family had aspired to higher social status, and he brings perspectives that were virtually unknown in your provincial corner of Europe, the Romans. Giovanni explains during one of your evening conversations, built an entire civilization without relying on Christian theology. They had law, government, art, literature, philosophy, everything that we associate with civilization, and they accomplished it all through human reason and effort. This observation is simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. Of course, the Romans existed before Christianity. Everyone knows that. But the idea that pre-Christian civilizations might have achieved things worth emulating, rather than simply serving as cautionary examples of pagan folly, represents a dramatic shift in perspective. Giovanni continues, what if the knowledge we lost when Rome fell wasn't just classical literature and engineering techniques? What if we also lost ways of thinking about human potential, individual dignity, and social organization that might be relevant to our current situation? These conversations lead you and others to begin experimenting with ideas that would have been considered heretical just a few years ago. Not atheism or outright rejection of Christianity, but rather the novel concept that human reason and divine revelation might both have legitimate roles in understanding the world. You start seeing evidence of this intellectual shift throughout the surviving communities in your region. People are asking questions about natural phenomena that they previously would have accepted as divine mysteries. They're experimenting with new agricultural techniques based on observation and trial and error rather than traditional practice. They're developing forms of local government based on practical necessity rather than feudal obligation. The artistic implications are perhaps even more significant than the philosophical ones. The plague years have produced a generation of artists, painters, sculptors, writers, musicians, who have intimate personal experience with death, suffering, and social upheaval. Their work reflects this experience in ways that break dramatically with medieval artistic conventions. You see this in the paintings commissioned for the new chapel that your community is building to replace the old church that burned down during the plague years. Instead of the stylized, symbolic religious art that dominated medieval aesthetics, these new works show human figures with realistic proportions, natural expressions, and individual characteristics that make them recognizable as actual people, rather than abstract representations of religious concepts. The difference is striking. Medieval religious art was designed to inspire awe, reverence, and submission to divine authority. This new style seems intended to celebrate human dignity, individual character, and the beauty of the natural world. It's art that acknowledges death and suffering. You can see it in the faces of the painted figures, but refuses to be defined entirely by those experiences. Even more revolutionary is the emergence of secular art, paintings, sculptures, and literature that deal with human experiences rather than religious themes. Love poetry that celebrates earthly passion rather than divine devotion. Portraits that commemorate individual achievement rather than spiritual virtue. Stories that explore human psychology and social relationships rather than moral instruction. This artistic evolution reflects a broader cultural shift toward what later generations will call humanism, the idea that human beings have inherent dignity and worth that exists independently of their relationship to divine authority. The educational changes are equally significant. The collapse of traditional ecclesiastical schools has created opportunities for new forms of learning based on classical models rather than exclusively theological curricula. Instead of spending years memorizing religious doctrine and commentary, students are learning rhetoric, logic, natural philosophy, and classical literature. You experience this personally when you decide to send your youngest son to the new school that Master Giovanni has established in the market town. The curriculum includes Latin and Greek language, classical literature, basic mathematics, and what Giovanni calls natural philosophy, essentially scientific observation and reasoning. Your son returns from his studies with ideas that would have been inconceivable for someone of his social background just a generation earlier. He can discuss Cicero's political philosophy, explain basic principles of geometry, and debate the relationship between reason and faith with a sophistication that rivals university-trained clergy. More importantly, he's learned to think critically about received wisdom, to question assumptions, and to seek evidence for claims rather than accepting them on authority alone. These intellectual habits, multiplied across an entire generation of plague survivors, represent a fundamental shift in European culture. The culmination of this transformation comes when your community decides to establish what amounts to a secular library, a collection of books, manuscripts, and documents that will be available to any literate person regardless of their religious status or social position. The library includes classical texts, contemporary works, practical manuals, and even some works that present ideas contrary to traditional church teaching. The decision to create this library generates considerable debate. Some community members worry that unrestricted access to dangerous ideas might corrupt public morals or undermine religious faith. Others argue that the free exchange of ideas and information is essential for the kind of society they want to build from the ruins of the old world. The debate itself is significant. The fact that ordinary people, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, feel qualified to discuss questions of knowledge, education, and social organization reflects a dramatic expansion of intellectual confidence and authority that would have been impossible under the old feudal system. In the end, the library is established with the understanding that readers will be responsible for evaluating what they read and drawing their own conclusions about its value and accuracy. It's a remarkable experiment in intellectual freedom that anticipates many of the principles that will later define Renaissance humanism. By 1355, the cultural landscape of Europe has been transformed as dramatically as its economic and social structures. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed many of the assumptions and institutions that had defined medieval civilization for centuries. In their place, a new culture is emerging that values individual dignity, celebrates human achievement, questions traditional authority, and seeks to understand the world through reason and observation rather than faith and tradition alone. You're not just surviving the aftermath of the greatest catastrophe in European history. You're participating in the birth of the Renaissance. The irony is perfect. It took the worst pandemic in human history to remind Europeans that life is beautiful, precious, and worth celebrating. It took mass death to inspire a cultural movement dedicated to human flourishing. It took the collapse of medieval certainties to create space for the intellectual curiosity and artistic innovation that will define the next phase of European civilization. Death, it turns out, makes surprisingly good fertilizer for cultural renewal. Congratulations. You just built the foundation of everything we call modern civilization. You probably didn't mean to, and you certainly didn't have a grand plan. But here we are in 2025, and the world you're living in right now was largely shaped by decisions made by plague survivors like you in the decades following 1348. It's 1375 now, and you're an old man by medieval standards, maybe 55, which makes you practically ancient in a world where most people were lucky to see 40. You've lived through the greatest catastrophe in European history, watched the collapse of a 1,000-year-old social order, and participated in building something entirely new from the ruins. But here's what you probably don't realize: the changes you helped create didn't stay in the Middle Ages. They echoed forward through centuries, shaping everything from modern democracy to capitalism to the scientific method to the very concept of individual human rights. You want to know how profound your influence has been? Let's start with something as basic as the way people think about work. Before the plague, work was considered a punishment, literally. The Bible taught that labor was God's curse on Adam for eating the forbidden fruit, something to be endured rather than embraced. The ideal life was one of prayer and contemplation, which is why monks who never did physical labor were considered more spiritually advanced than farmers who fed everyone. But when you and your fellow survivors found yourselves with unprecedented economic opportunities, you accidentally invented something revolutionary. The idea that work could be a path to advancement, dignity, and personal fulfillment. Remember when you negotiated with Sir Edmund for better wages and working conditions? That wasn't just a business transaction, it was the birth of modern labor relations. The concept that workers have the right to bargain for fair compensation. That labor has inherent value beyond mere survival, that people can improve their circumstances through their own efforts. These ideas, which we now take completely for granted, were revolutionary innovations born from plague-era necessity. Your great-great-great-grandchildren will call this the Protestant work ethic, though it emerged 2 centuries before Protestantism existed. They'll build entire economic theories around the concept that individual initiative and hard work create prosperity for everyone. They'll establish stock markets, corporations, and global trade networks based on principles you developed when you decided to partner with Thomas on that grain mill venture. The political changes you initiated were even more far-reaching. When traditional feudal authorities collapsed and you began making collective decisions about village governance, you were conducting the first experiments in what will eventually become representative democracy. Those village meetings where you debated crop rotation, taxation, and resource allocation. You were essentially creating the first local governments based on consent of the governed rather than divine right of kings. The idea that ordinary people are capable of making rational decisions about their own affairs. That political authority derives from the people rather than from God or hereditary privilege. These concepts will eventually inspire the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and virtually every democratic movement in human history. Your decision to establish that secular library was particularly significant. By asserting that knowledge should be available to everyone rather than controlled by religious authorities, you helped launch what historians will call the democratization of learning. This principle will eventually lead to public education systems. Universities open to all social classes, freedom of the press, and the entire concept of intellectual freedom that defines modern democratic societies. The scientific revolution that begins in the 16th century, it traces directly back to the intellectual curiosity and empirical thinking that you and your contemporaries developed while trying to understand why traditional explanations for the plague proved so inadequate. When you started questioning received wisdom and seeking evidence-based answers to practical problems, you were laying the groundwork for the scientific method. Francis Bacon, Galileo Newton, Darwin, they'll all be building on intellectual foundations that you helped establish when you decided that human reason was a legitimate tool for understanding the natural world. The economic innovations you pioneered had even more dramatic consequences. That joint venture with Thomas wasn't just a business partnership. It was an early example of entrepreneurial capitalism, the idea that individuals can create wealth through innovation and risk-taking, that markets can efficiently allocate resources. That competition drives improvement. These principles will eventually transform the entire global economy. The banking systems that will finance the age of exploration, the Industrial Revolution, and modern global commerce all trace back to the financial innovations developed by plague survivors who needed new ways to manage the sudden wealth redistribution caused by mass death. Even more fundamentally, the social mobility you experienced during the plague years established the principle that merit should matter more than birth. This concept, radical in your time, will eventually become so basic to modern thinking that we can barely imagine alternatives. Your sister Margaret's successful management of her own property helped establish precedents for women's economic rights that will slowly expand over the following centuries. The legal changes implemented to accommodate the reality of female property ownership during the plague years will provide the foundation for later advances in women's rights, including eventually the right to vote, own businesses, and participate fully in economic and political life. The urban transformations you witnessed laid the groundwork for modern city planning, commercial law, and international trade networks. Those boom towns that emerged from nowhere, they pioneered many of the administrative and commercial innovations that will make modern cities possible. But perhaps your most important contribution was psychological rather than institutional. You lived through the collapse of a worldview based on rigid hierarchy, unchanging tradition, and divine predestination. In its place, you helped create a culture that values individual agency, social mobility, and the possibility of progress through human effort. This optimistic, forward-looking mindset, the idea that the future can be better than the present, that human beings can improve their circumstances through reason and work, that change is opportunity rather than threat, will become the driving force behind virtually every major advance in human civilization. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of modern science, the development of democratic government, the expansion of human rights, all of these movements draw inspiration and intellectual energy from ideas that you and your fellow plague survivors developed while simply trying to rebuild functional communities from the wreckage of the old world. You didn't set out to transform human civilization. You were just trying to survive, prosper, and build decent lives for yourselves and your children. But in the process of solving immediate, practical problems, you accidentally created the intellectual, economic, and social frameworks that still shape the modern world. The irony is delicious. It took the worst catastrophe in European history to create the conditions for humanity's greatest advances. It took mass death to inspire innovations that would eventually allow billions of people to live healthier, more prosperous, and more fulfilling lives than had ever been possible before. When you negotiated for fair wages, you were creating modern labor relations. When you questioned traditional authorities, you were advancing intellectual freedom. When you started businesses based on merit rather than birth, you were pioneering social mobility. When you treated women as capable of independent decision-making, you were expanding human rights. When you built communities based on cooperation rather than coercion, you were experimenting with democratic governance. Every time you chose adaptation over tradition, innovation over convention, evidence over authority, you were participating in the creation of modernity itself. The world I'm speaking to you from, a world of unprecedented prosperity, technological advancement, and individual freedom, exists because people like you made millions of small, practical decisions during the years following the Black Death. Decisions that seemed minor at the time, but accumulated into the greatest transformation in human history. You are not just survivors of the plague. You are the founders of the modern world. And the best part, you're still building it. Every person who chooses education over ignorance, cooperation over domination, innovation over tradition, evidence over superstition is continuing the work that you began in the ruins of medieval Europe. The plague killed half of Europe, but the survivors created something unprecedented, a civilization based on human potential rather than divine predestination, individual merit rather than inherited privilege, rational inquiry rather than received wisdom. Not bad for a bunch of traumatized peasants who were just trying to figure out how to plant crops and run businesses without getting killed by mysterious diseases. You've come a long way from that one room cottage you shared with your family and livestock. The world you helped create stretches from this moment all the way back to that terrible autumn of 1347, when the first ships arrived carrying death, and unknowingly, the seeds of everything we now call progress. The future was built by the past, and you were there when it happened.